welcome to day 2 of Biology 420, Evolutionary Biology. I hope you guys were able to have a good experience yesterday with the recorded lecture or looking at the website, etc. I hope that you're finding a good strategy and pathway forward in this class. If not, feel free to reach out to me. Let's communicate. I realize this is not ideal, but I want to do the very best that I can for each one of you. This topic is really important to me. And I want to make sure that you learn to the level that you would like in this class. On that topic, I think Learning Suite was down yesterday. I got several notifications and emails from people saying that it was published and unpublished and published and unpublished. That happened across both my courses. I think that was just a Learning Suite issue, but as I understand it today, that's been largely resolved, and everyone's been able to get into the courses and look at them. So go ahead. Learning Suite is quickly, for this course, is quickly filling out. We have some of the labs up already. The rubrics are all up for the writing assignments and everything that we'll be doing in the course. The syllabus is up, and we hope that you can get in there and lay out a strategy that will be successful for you in this class. And as I already mentioned, we're happy to help. So I'd just like to start in with today's lecture, and we're going to talk about some of the evidences for the theory of evolution. But in terms of evidence, well, we'll get to that in a minute. I guess we'll just start here with this. I don't know, do any of you guys know what this fossil is? Some of you guys probably took Bio 130 and read your inner fish. This fossil right here plays a prominent role in that book. And if you look at it, just take a look at this. I mean, what does this look like? Does it look like, does it look like a hybrid of something? Is there any anatomical, morphological features that stand out to you? Go ahead and have a good hard look at this and try and figure out what this is in your mind. And then when you've done that, take a second and follow this link down below, and you actually get to read about what this fossil is, what the importance of it is, how it fits into evolution, and kind of extending this theory of evolution. And as a matter of fact, we're going to talk a little bit about fossils today, and their importance in biology. So let's go ahead and move forward. So here's some questions for you that I want you to consider. What is evolution? How do you study evolution? And why study evolution? And I just want you to take a full minute and consider each one of those questions. So go ahead and hit the pause button right now. Okay, hopefully you did hit the pause button, although I'm pretty sure most of you didn't. That's okay. So when we're looking at what is evolution, there's the strict definition that we can have. I'm going to go ahead and close my camera now. You guys know what I look like. You know what my office looks like. Hopefully we'll see each other here together at some point in time to discuss the course. And if you look at the strict definition of what is evolution, it's any change that's inherited in a population that occurs from one generation to the next. Now, the really important thing that's inherent in this is that change is over a time period longer than the lifespan of an individual, what that really means is that individuals do not evolve, populations evolve. How do you study evolution? You study evolution by observation, just like any science anywhere. You observe. Experimentation is another one. We've actually done some experiments in my lab that have been really cool to kind of try and understand some of the evolutionary mechanisms and scenarios out in nature. But most often when we're studying evolution, we're doing some sort of reconstruction. And that generally involves some sort of historical view, using phylogeny, using the paleo record, other things like that, where we're going back and we're literally trying to reconstruct something because we can't observe it directly. And I should mention really quickly that I think that this is actually one of the major sticking points with people accepting evolution, that it's something that they cannot see and observe directly, because it's taken billions of years to bring about our world today. So it's really hard on people to be convinced. And you'll even see people who are convinced of microevolution but they can't be convinced of macroevolution. And the difference is that generally, not generally, but often with microevolution, you can observe it. But we'll get to more of that later on. So why study evolution? Well, evolution is biology's glue. As we've mentioned before, evolution is really the thing that pulls together all of biology and gives us the perspective of how life on Earth evolves, functions, and will continue to function. It explains a lot of the connections we see between different species. So a lot of departments across the country are ecology and evolution, and that acknowledges this fact that all species are interconnected, whether they're from the same phylogenetic group or not. If they're in the same ecosystem, there's probably some sort of connection going on there, and that's all been driven by evolutionary processes. It gives us, continuing on that same theme, it gives us the reasons why species live in the areas that they do and why species have the adaptations that they do. And it's really evolution extends well beyond just the biologies. It's actually a major foundational part in fields like biochemistry and medicine. Now, medicine is in the biologies, right, because we are living organisms too, but evolution actually has quite a bit of sway in medicine, especially these days. There's been a lot more integration of evolutionary principles. And then, of course, genetics, embryology, a lot of these are right at the crux of evolution. So here's the big picture. What evidence supports the theory of evolution? We'll kind of try and get to that. And what evidence, if found, would refute it? So I want you to think about this. In your mind, what evidences are you aware of that support the theory of evolution? And I have theory in red. Sometimes we can have a discussion about this, but I think you being generally juniors and seniors in this class, you guys all understand that theory in science is very different than the way we would say theory to a friend or family. That theory is something that is a hypothesis, a fact, well proven. A theory is about as substantial a fact as you can get in science, but it's still a hypothesis, so it's kind of hard to wrap your head around. But anyway, I want you to ask that question: what evidence supports the theory of evolution, and what evidence, if found, would refute it? So go ahead, hit the pause button, give yourself 30 seconds to think this through. Okay, we're gonna keep going here. When we look at the diversity of what's on Earth, right? So, and this is, I'm trying to pull in some of the diversity that a scientist in Darwin's day and age would have been aware of, right? That mostly focused on these large animals, although Darwin did appreciate insects, so I've thrown a few of those in, some plants, but really at this point in time, it was almost like a catalog system, right? This is what they had to appreciate biology. And this fundamental question had just barely begun to be asked. What process can account for the observed patterns of the diversity of life on Earth? And we can talk a lot about process, and that's what we'll do in this class. We'll talk quite a bit about process. But for this class, I'd like to start with patterns. And further, I would like those patterns to be centered around, we'll use these patterns as the evidences of what Darwin would have had access to at the time. So what patterns in the natural world were known to Darwin is the question we're going to ask. And we're going to start. So there's about 7 patterns that I'll cover, and there were almost certainly more, but these are some of the highlights. So this idea of nested hierarchical structure of life. So Aristotle had his Scala Naturae, this great chain of being, but inherent in this was this general idea that there was some sort of progress towards perfection or this final outcome that's super ideal. And what's interesting to that is when you look, right, you have down here all these non-beings, right? Then you come to plants and animals and humans, and apparently if you're looking at this scale, right, even demons are higher than humans. I'm sure we can all think of a few. that might actually be better, right? Then you have angels, and then of course you have God, which is quite hilarious, right? That our doctrine might actually fit this pretty well. But just the same, I think this is a very humanistic view of the natural world, and who can fault these people at this time? This is what they're grappling with. This is the way the culture was. But what's actually really cool is even within this scale, there's even more refinement. So if you look here with animals and humans, you have the cnidarians down here, mollusks, arthropods, and then crustaceans. So apparently crustaceans, maybe because they were edible, were better than other arthropods. Cephalopods, reptiles, birds, whales, land mammals. So you can see that there's this inherent idea of progression within these scales. Also known to Darwin at the time, of course, right, there was the Linnaean classification system that was based on shared similarity. They had the binomial nomenclature, right, we're Homo sapiens, some of our relatives, right, Homo diurnus. Continuing on, we have the proponents of natural theology, just trying to push us forward that God can be found in nature. So some other evidence here, some other patterns that were known, fossils. So even, back in Darwin's time, people had found these mammoths that were clearly no longer on Earth. So how do you explain those? And then there was this thing right here, right? I don't know if any of you are hunters, but if you were, this would be the ultimate animal. This is the Irish elk, and these antlers can be, I've seen them in person, and it seems to me that they're upwards of 10 feet across. Just an enormous animal that clearly was beautiful. Some sort of almost cross, larger, but looks like a cross between an elk and a moose that was much larger than either one of those animals. Also, we have succession in fossils, and I think this is really well illustrated by Jello. So what we're going to do is we're going to have the first question for this lecture that I'll also put this on Learning Suite, so you can go and answer this afterwards. I'm just going to buzz right through it, but basically you should be able to read this Jello top to bottom and answer this question. Patterns, so additional patterns known to Darwin, continuing on with this idea of succession of fossil types. So Lyell, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, had this geological principles of succession. And he had fancy words to go along with it, and we should run through them so that you're aware. So superposition, this is the idea that the bottom layers are older than the upper layers. And for any of you who've experimented or looked around with throwing things, even in, for example, if you're throwing sand or mud or dirt in water, you're going to see layers build up. I actually had this really cool experience one time where I was on the island of Molokai doing research there, and we had to drive from next to the ocean to one of the highest mountaintops there to do some research on some of the endemic dragonflies that live in Hawaii. And it's probably maybe about 45-minute drive, but as you go, you're down on the beach with these white sand beaches, and then as you go up, you're passing into different levels and colors of kind of your tan to deep red soil as you go up. And what was really cool is by the time we got to the top, you could run your finger through the back bumper, which had accumulated probably over 1/4 of an inch of different soil layers. And as you ran your finger through it, you could actually see the different layers that had accumulated on the bumper, and you could see how the lower layers were older than the upper layers. As you can see, when we were driving on the dirt roads down by the ocean, they were white, and then as we went up to the really red clay soils towards the summit of where we were going, that's what the top layer looked like, and all these different colors in between. It was absolutely really cool. I wish I had taken a picture of it. You also have original horizontality. This is the idea that things are originally laid down in a horizontal fashion. And cross-cutting structure is younger than the structure it crosses. So we'll talk about some of these in a second. An inclusion is just a structure that's held within a layer. And then uniformitarianism, really means that what happens now is what's always what's always happened on Earth, right? That hasn't changed, that there aren't new rules now to geology than there were back in the beginning of Earth. And kind of just to do a quick run through, so here you have this intrusion that cross cuts these two layers, and that would mean that intrusion B is what? Older or younger? Think about it for a second. So if you said younger, you're correct, right? Because what it means is these two layers had to be laid down before this one could cut through. So I know this can be a little bit confusing for students, but just kind of try and keep it straight and keep it pretty simple. We won't go too deep in this class. Succession of fossil types. So looking at these, you have this range of fossils, and as they're laid down within the different layers. So each fossil is going to have its own unique time range. There's going to be overlapping ranges, which will help us to provide time markers, and also use fossils as indices for the age of certain layers. And it's also going to allow us to permit correlation between strata, so both locally and globally. So here are some examples of this. Right, if you're looking at this, you can say that these two mountain ranges, let's say, could be miles and miles apart, even hundreds of miles apart. But when you're looking at them, you can correlate this strata here with this strata here simply by the fossils that are present in them. Because you know that even though the composition in which the fossils are found is a little different, right? This one looks like bricks. This one is more thin layered strata. You know that these fossils would have been present at the same time on the Earth, and so you can actually match up and get an age for these. Pretty cool, being able to correlate fossils and the age of the Earth. Here's another example. I just want you to take about a minute and look at these and ask yourself what's going on here, what's being illustrated, what rules are at play, what laws are at play. You have your basic, almost perfect striation here, some variation here, something different that happened here, and then you have this structure coming in the middle. What's the oldest? What's the youngest? What could have formed these? And then we'll run through it. So go ahead and hit pause. Okay, so if we run through this real quick, we're going to look at obviously G, right, is going to be the oldest layer. A is going to be the youngest. If we go to B, so the sedimentary layers, they match across the valley, which is actually a really important point to make. Now, sometimes tectonic plates can make A go higher, and maybe, there can be examples like we saw previously where one of these can shift, or even A and B can be wiped out. And the only thing you have across the valley is C, D, and E, but they might be even equal level, or C, D, and E can even be higher, but you can correlate that way. Here in D, we'll just go with D first, right? This is an igneous intrusion that has come up through the sedimentary layers, showing us that this igneous intrusion is actually younger than the sedimentary rock around it. And then you've also got issues like this, right, where you can see where there's been a break or a fracture, where things were originally laid down like A, B, C, and D, and then they can be tilted through geologic uplift or whatever it may be, and then you actually end up with A, B, C, and D on their side. So we have the before tilting and after tilting. Okay, some other patterns. Geographical relationships of similar species. So this is Wallace, who we talked about last time, a contemporary of Darwin, and actually graciously from Darwin's part was considered a co-discoverer of evolution, of the theory of evolution. But he has this quote that every species has come into existence coincident both in space, which is really important, and time with a pre-existing closely allied species. And this is really cool, right? Because we're looking at two different species of kangaroo here from Australia, and they inhabit different habitats, but because they're found in the same space and general time, they're going to look very similar to each other, meaning that species are going to share similar geographical relationships. And we're going to dig into this a little bit more deeply. Now, there are also false things like this, right, where we have penguins and polar bears together. This is perhaps my personal favorite right here. But this is totally false, right? You have polar bears that are found up here in green, right, that they're in the Arctic. And then you have the penguins, which are down here in the Arctic, right? So actually, what's interesting here is that Arctic means with bears and Antarctic means without. So kind of keep that in mind as to help break down some of the barriers you might see in our own advertising. But these patterns were really impressive to people like Darwin at the time, right? These patterns argued that species came from single centers and then, by descent with modification, formed existing species. And so their geographic range was actually limited by their ability to migrate and move to other suitable habitats. And we see this all around the world, right? So you guys have probably heard of something called Wallace's Line, but this is something that's found over in Southwest Asia, just north of Australia, where down here you have a very Australian fauna that pushes all the way up almost to Borneo, and then there's this really stark line that gets drawn right here, and most of the fauna and flora from this side comes from Asia. Now, this is a result of this area being separated in time and having different groups evolving in different ways according to where their ancestral fauna were coming from. And then as these islands approached each other, they still show that distinct Asian fauna and fauna. As I mentioned, right, the naturalists were just fascinated by the distribution of plants and animals around the world. This is one of the, as I mentioned, right, that they were doing a lot of cataloging at this time. So very naturally, they started to look at where animals were distributed, what habitats they were associated with, and trying to make sense of this. But there were still things that really held them up, right? So you've got things like the Cape Verde Islands and the Galapagos. And the question is, well, why do the Galapagos and the Cape Verde Islands have such different biota, despite the fact that they're both island ecosystems? And kind of the same thing, right? Why does the Arctic have polar bears and the Antarctic have penguins? Why don't they both have both? What could be holding them up? And it's this idea of where organisms evolve, and they have to have a common ancestor as kind of that seed, right, to put them there. So there was this idea that species arose from existing species in single centers by descent with modification. And then again, to kind of touch on what we talked about earlier, this geographic range was really limited by the ability of these animals to migrate to other suitable environments. And we see this these really cool patterns all throughout the world, right? So this is another one when we're considering biogeography and the geographic relationships of similar species. If you look in South America, even up into Central America and Southern North America, and compare with what you're seeing in Africa. So Africa has their ostrich, right? South America has their version of the ostrich. And then even Australia and New Zealand had really large birds that were associated with really large birds that all had this same common ancestor, and they were able to move around the world. And the question is, well, how did this happen? Why are they all around the world when there's no ability for these birds who are flightless to cross oceans? And that has to do with the way the world used to be connected. And once you look at the way the world used to be connected and the current distribution of these large flightless bird species, it actually makes a lot of sense why they're there and how they're there. I'll let you kind of soak that up for a minute. One of the things we can do is we can look really quickly at the way the Earth used to be and the way it is now. Looking at, this is one that takes a little longer. This one takes about 12 minutes, so we won't watch that one. but we have this other one that projects forward what the Earth will look like in 250 million years. But I would recommend that you watch both of them. This one goes from 240 or 50 million years ago, I think, to 250 million years in the present. This one goes from right now to 250 million years in the present.
Hey, bro, I'm here. Can you open the door?
Sorry for the commercial.
Let me in. Come on. Sorry.
Here we go. So I don't know if you guys were able to follow that, and I assume you were, but really fascinating to think about. Essentially what you end up with there is one large landmass 250 million years from now, and about 250 million years ago we also had a very similar landmass. So it's interesting to think about how the biodiversity of Earth will go on in evolution as these continents over the next 250 million years come back together. So some of the other biogeography things that we can talk about is we can make predictions as scientists, right? If our hypothesis is that the Earth used to be one landmass, and that's what explains the distribution of these ostrich-like birds, these large flightless birds, then we should be able to see it in other organisms now today. And we actually do, right? Earlier fossils and other extant lineages predate actually the separation of South America, Antarctica, and Australia about 70 million years ago. We actually see this in marsupials, their distributions on Earth, dragonflies, and plants. So one of the examples I'll show, of course, is dragonflies. On the west coast here and just into Argentina, I mentioned this last time, right? There's this really special dragonfly group in here. The one I mentioned last time was Neopetalia, but there's another one that's called Hypopetalia, and it's found right here in Chile and Argentina. And if you go all the way around to the east coast in Australia, you find the other closest living species of this family group, Australopitalia, here in Australia. And what this means is back in the day when this was all one landmass, these organisms probably had a very large distribution from this part of South America all the way across to Australia. And as the continents pulled apart and the center of Australia became more arid, that these species distributions either shrank or there were species that went extinct. And now all that we're left with is this signature of dragonflies being found in Australia and South America, showing us that at one point in time these continents shared quite a bit of biota. So question number 2 that I'll also put on Learning Suite. Darwin was aware of similarities between embryos and different species. To Darwin, this suggested what? And I'll let you go ahead and answer that. I'm just going to keep moving on. So Darwin knew at this point in time, due to some really fantastic embryological work that had been done, that embryos of a lot of different organisms, so here we're showing tons of different vertebrate species, that they all shared very similar formations in time. For example, humans at one point in time, all of us, as we went through our embryological development, had gills, and we even had a tail with many vertebrae in that tail. And during our development, the development of that tail was terminated, and bones actually fused. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But it's just this idea that we all still share remnants of our past in our embryology. There's also this idea of these common blueprints in the structures that we have. Richard Owens referred to this as structural homology, and you may have talked about homology in some of your classes to this point, but here's an example. Here's an opportunity to look at it. So if we're looking here, we have homologous structures. The flipper of a whale and the leg of a cat are homologous. You can actually see the similar bones. So the orange bones here are homologous between a whale and a cat, all the way down to the fingers, to the finger bones, essentially, that in a whale fill in the flipper, and in the cat form some of the toes that lead to the claws. Also in insects, you have these homologous insect structures where you have this praying mantis leg and a water boatman leg. So the praying mantis leg is used for capturing prey, devouring them, and in the water boatman, they almost have this flipper-like leg that allows them to swim in water. Now, when you compare these are analogous structures this way, right? So even though the water boatman has a leg that moves it through water, and the whale does as well, you'll notice that these are not evolved from a common ancestor. These are independently evolved, so we call them analogous structures. And the same thing with the cat leg and the praying mantis leg. These blueprints are really fantastic when you look at them broadly. So this right here would be essentially the vertebrate blueprint for the vertebrate limb. And you have in bats, you can see how it's all been extended differently to form the structures in their wings. So bats are essentially flying with their fingers, right? And then you have the dolphin that we already covered, right? One of the fascinating things here is that you have in the horse, right, that the horse essentially walks on its middle finger range, right? That all the other bones have been reduced and pulled back, and that the hoof is actually just a very large nail. Anyway, I'll let you experiment and look at this, but it's incredibly fascinating, this design, these ideas of the blueprints. Vestigial organs is also another pattern and evidence that Darwin was aware of. These are organs that are no longer useful, or even that are no longer useful in organisms, but are still present. So I'll run through a few, right? In humans, every now and then babies are born with tails. We have our wisdom teeth that actually a large part of the human population, I think it's somewhere between 3 and 4%. I shouldn't say large, right? But a significant portion of our population actually has no wisdom teeth anymore. I know I was missing 2 wisdom teeth. I have a daughter who has none. I said, lucky her. So something to think about. This cave fish, some of you guys might be looking at this and you're like, well, like it can't really be vestigial if it's just missing the eye. Well, what's interesting is that where the eye used to be, there are still genes that should be expressed in the eye that are expressed in the tissues. Even though the eye is completely wiped out through evolution, because this lives in a cave, it doesn't need to receive or discern between different colors or or receive light, but those genes are still expressed in the tissue of where the eye would be. And then, of course, the appendix. And just showing a little bit about how that tail was actually pretty well formed in that kiddo. All right. Some vestigial organs that we can talk about in depth, right? The appendix or the cecum. This is one that always gets people kind of a little bit upset, because the human appendix does have function. Well, is hypothesized to have function, and one of those functions is that it's this repository for good positive bacteria in our digestive tract, and every now and then when we get sick or whatever it may be, and our digestive tract flushes out, that some of those remnants are kept here to repopulate the digestive tract. And that very well may be the function of the appendix in humans. But the fact of the matter is that what we are left with, regardless of what it's doing today, is a completely vestigial, reduced organ to what we see in other animals. And we also see the reduction of this organ across a lot of animals as they, depending on the type of food that they feed on. So you'll notice that these larger animals feed entirely on plants, right? They're herbivores and they have larger appendices, whereas these organisms are essentially omnivores, although some of you might consider yourself only an herbivore or a carnivore, but just the same, they reduce as diets shift. Some other vestigial organisms or organs or atavisms that we can check out. Here's one. This is one of my personal favorites, and I apologize, some of this has been covered up, but you can see that some human beings, hopefully you can download the slides and move those around a little bit. Some human beings grow hair all over their bodies from head to foot. I don't know if any of you guys have ever noticed a little dimple on the side of your ear here. These dimples actually have to do with, that's the remnants of a gill. A large part of your ear is made from the gill, from what is the gill structure in the fish, and every now and then there's a little dimple that's found at the base of the ear. Now, I knew I loved my wife the moment that I heard her voice, actually, and we hit it off really quick. But after we'd been married, I don't know, 10 or 12 years, I found out that this little dimple that had been at the base of her ear ever since I had known her was actually part of her evolutionary history, and it's a gill, and I loved her even more. And she hates it when I tell that story, but it's true. These pictures unfortunately got covered up, but sometimes you'll notice the human ear will have a little loop on it at the top, a little extension of flesh. That's actually from our primate ancestry. Looking here, normally in humans there's just two nipples, but there are tons of examples of humans being born with multiple nipples, and some really funny stories that I could tell that I won't, but I'll mention this one. On my mission, we once had a football game where we chose teams between those with two nipples and two nipples and more than two nipples, and believe it or not, we got teams of 7. Thinking back about it, I'm really impressed that missionaries in my mission at the time were aware of the fact that they had multiple nipples. There are some more vestigial organs that you can look at here. There's a really cool YouTube clip. I would highly encourage you to follow along with that. There's some that we haven't covered that you'll be able to see there, some in babies and grip and lots of different interesting things. So looking at these patterns, right, these are the patterns or evidences that were known to Darwin. And certainly there were a few more, because I'm not an exact historian. I wasn't there in Darwin's head. But these are the ones that you'll be held accountable for, that we know Darwin was aware of at the time. So now you know a little bit about, pretty much about what Darwin knew at the time. So I want you to just put yourself in his place and think about what process, right? We've talked about all these patterns and these evidences. What process could explain this evidence? And one caveat here is that your model must account for all the known data, right? You can't come up with some sort of process or model that only accounts for 3 or 4 of what we saw. It has to account for all of them. And then, can you think of an alternative to descent with modification, i.e. evolution? And then I'll challenge you just a tiny bit more. Can you think of an alternative that is scientifically testable? So go ahead and hit the mute button. Give yourself, 15, 20 seconds to think that through. Okay, let's move on. So Darwin had two big ideas, right, that he came up with. One of them was tree thinking, which is essentially the theory of evolution, and the other is natural selection, which is a hypothesis about how evolution occurs. How does the theory of evolution reconcile the following patterns, right? You have this fossil and geological record, structural similarity, vestigial traits, geographic affinities. How does it do this? Well, Darwin came out with the origin of the species in 1859, and he did it with his two big ideas. And the number one is tree thinking. And I realize for us, in our day and age, we think about these and you're like, man, it's so simple. And I even had this experience once where I went to Darwin's house just outside of London. And as I was walking through, they were talking about how this is such a central theory and how this thought was, just earth-shattering, and how it's one of the most important thoughts in biology, if not science. And while I was walking through, I was like, well, whatever. I mean, it's so simple. It's so obvious. Like, anyone would think of this. But the fact of the matter is with the constraints, the cultural constraints, the scientific constraints, the philosophical constraints of the time, they just didn't think this way. And this is why this is such a big deal that we've all benefited from. And so us looking back, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but this was enormous. So his number one idea, tree thinking, and this is from Darwin's Origin. The affinities of all the beings of the same class have sometimes been represented by a great tree. I believe this simile largely speaks to the truth. And so you kind of have this idea, right, that there's this tree of life. Now, of course, man is still sitting at the top, right, because we're seen as the ultimate organism and species, and we are very successful in our own right, outcompeting and essentially hurting a lot of the species around us with our abilities to think and function and do other things. But what I really want to emphasize is, this was kind of the tree, or maybe the idea of Darwin back in the day, and this right here is where we are today. And this is a small one, where we're able to use all sorts of genetic data, morphological data, behavioral data to create this enormous tree of life to help us figure out who's most closely related to who's unique genetically, who has these crazy awesome modifications, and harness this to essentially improve the world around us. Okay, idea number two is this idea of natural selection. Now, of the two ideas, this one is a little less worked out, right? This is the one that we're continuously working on. This is an example of my own family. These are my grandparents here, and this is their progeny. These are their children and their grandchildren at a family reunion. And I'm not even sure this is all of them, to be honest. But there's this surplus, this ability to reproduce lots of individuals, and and this idea of fitness, right? Those that leave behind more progeny are going to be more fit. And one of the things I'll emphasize here, these are my parents, these are my siblings right here. And if you wanted to, if you're wondering, like I do all the time, who's the fittest among us in my family, it's clearly me. I have 7 children. No one else in my family comes close. I think the closest is 5. So I'm up 2. But when we talk about this idea of reproduction, right, that this can change from generation to generation, which can affect the ability of natural selection to work in terms of diversity. The way if you think of natural selection as a filter, right, if there's fewer individuals, there's less to filter. But the previous generation, right, 6.3 kids, and the current generation is 4.16 kids. And in my family, with the exception of me, our family's right at this average here. Or as you can see in my grandparents' generation, more children. So you have this idea of reproduction, and then that comes up against survival. and that's where natural selection happens. So you can imagine if you're going to have a bunch of beavers cutting down trees this way, the genetics of cutting a tree and having it fall on you is going to be filtered from the population very quickly, whereas those beavers that are much better at cutting trees down without it falling on them due to their ability to cut one side almost all the way through and then cut the other, would make them safer. So you can think about how the genetics in just cutting a tree down among a beaver population can be affected. Also, some others in the human population. Here's some Darwin moments. And I should point out as well, right, we have this very dramatic photo here. If a train comes through there, it's very clear that all four of these individuals would be wiped out from the human gene pool. But what's happening here is this high voltage fence, right? That this high voltage fence may not actually kill these two individuals, but it may maim them enough that their genetics are essentially isolated from the population. Thus, natural selection has done its job. So here again, the patterns. And you have this idea of consilience, right? This is this co-occurring, this coincidence, this concurrence of ideas. And it really takes place when you have one class of facts that starts to coincide or collide, not in a destructive sense, but coinciding together, that helps you really better understand another different class of facts, and that's what we have with evolution. So, to have a discussion, what's the difference between the theory of evolution and the hypothesis of natural selection? So we just kind of outlined them in Darwin's two big ideas. I want you to take a second and see if you can tease these apart in your mind. So go ahead and hit the pause button. Okay, so let's keep going. There's this really fantastic quote by Dobzhansky, which I think helps us kind of understand what we're talking about in between the theory of evolution and the hypothesis of natural selection. And he said, "Let me try to make crystal clear what is established beyond reasonable doubt and what needs further study about evolution. Evolution as a process that has always gone on in the history of the earth can be doubted only by those who are ignorant of the evidence or are resistant to evidence owing to emotional blocks or plain bigotry. By contrast, the mechanisms that bring evolution about certainly need study and clarification. There are no alternatives to evolution as history that can withstand critical examination, yet we are constantly learning new and important facts about evolutionary mechanisms." And I think this outlines very well where the field of evolutionary biology is at this point in time. And I also think it's a very solid view and something that's frankly reflected in our current society, not just on the theory of evolution, but in other ways as well. So our next lecture, we're going to talk about who influenced Darwin to come up with his big ideas. Did others have it first? And then what happened to evolutionary theory after Darwin? And I'll just leave you with this little cartoon here. We've alluded to some of this. We'll get to it later on in the semester, but I just think it's pretty hilarious. And I hope you guys are having a great day. Hopefully this lecture was helpful. Feel free to hit me up on Learning Suite, send some emails to me and or the TAs. Let them know what questions you have, how you're feeling about the course, what we might be able to do more to help you out. And I hope that's helpful. So that's where we'll end. Have a good day.